So how far back in time can George Clooney really take us?
What happens when a society is much more mobile? What happens when economies collapse? What happens with gender systems that are undergoing transformation?
We're talking Up in the Air on Historians of the Movies podcast. Welcome to Historians at the Movies podcast. I am your host, Jason Herbert, creator of Historians at the Movies, the allegedly longest running watch party on the internet. Each week we are bringing you top scholars and historians to talk about the movies we love and why they matter. And I am so geeked out right now because the guy we're going to talk to today is like, when I was a baby historian, I was like, this guy is the man, and I wanted to like follow all his stuff. And then he became like a legit friend. So I'm super excited for you guys to hear him. And he's Brett Rushforth. He's a scholar of the early American Atlantic world. His research focuses on comparative slavery, Native North America, and French colonialism and empire. He's the author of Bonds of Alliance, one of these like classic reading books you have to read, Indigenous and Atlantic Slaveries in New France, which examined the enslavement of American Indians by French colonists and their native allies, tracing the dynamic interplay between native systems of captivity and slavery and French plantation-based racial slavery. With his co-author, Chris Hodgson, he has just completed yet another book, Discovering Empire, France and the Atlantic World from the Age of Crusading to the Age of Revolutions, which will be published by Oxford University Press. He also teaches at the University of Oregon, and this year he is a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at Huntington Library. I'm also seeing in this email he sent to me earlier, here's a bio you could use. Brett Rushforth is just a dude who loves movies.
That seems about right.
So, Brett, thank you so much for being here. I got one question for you, and that is, what is in your backpack?
Well, that's nothing. I've emptied it out. I want to divulge my little secret here. I've broken all connections. I live in a cocoon of self-banishment.
A limited cocoon of self-banishment sounds like what we like put on for job talks or like graduate applications. Do you want to come work in the historical field? What you're talking about is a limited cocoon of self-banishment.
That's about right.
We were talking a little bit earlier when I said, hey, let's do this podcast. And you're like, definitely, let's do it. And I said, any movie you want. And I'm thinking, all right, sweet. We're going to talk New France, which is a place I don't even know because I work in Florida. And you were like, Up in the Air. And I said, yes, that makes – why are we talking about Up in the Air and George Clooney? What's going on with this?
Yeah, so it's really funny. One of the questions that you said you might want to talk about is why this movie. And I don't know that I have an answer, except that when I watched it, it was when it first came out, and it had come out, sort of following the deep recession, post 2008. And, the central theme of the movie is, it surrounds this character who fires people for a living. And, so it was set in this deep recession. Most of it's set in the Midwest. So like you go up to Detroit, for example, and they, fire a bunch of people from Big Auto because it's faltering. And for whatever reason, it was just the kind of film that captured the human angle on a sort of abstraction that was around us. We were all feeling our version of this crisis. I was sitting on a house I couldn't sell, but I had moved across the country. And so, each of us had our little piece of this. But I thought it captured that moment really well. But the other thing was that Clooney's performance is so good. And he carries along the dialogue, which is also so good. And there's a real surprise ending in some ways. And for whatever reason, I absolutely did not see it coming. And so sometimes there's just this, I don't know, I guess there's sort of a reward I want to give someone for truly surprising me. So it's this kind of combination of like the least surprising thing of all, which is kind of what we were all experiencing, this real historic moment that is going to be in textbooks in the future. Maybe it already is. And then this complete surprise. And I thought that juxtaposition kept me interested. And, I keep rewatching it. So, there's a lot more to say, I suppose, but that's kind of I think what originally grabbed me. And then, there's a lot more that could be said about just like there's a whole question about gender dynamics and expectations. There's a question about connection versus isolation. There's questions of travel and belonging and home. What is home? So some of these big questions that we kind of address in historical work many times. What happens when a society is much more mobile? What happens when economies collapse? What happens with gender systems that are undergoing transformation? And what about technology, right? We're sitting right now in a moment where we've really had to wrestle with taking things online. And one of the central themes in this movie from 11, 12 years ago is about this sort of remote practice of letting people go from their jobs via the internet and sort of all the potential and problems with that. So, I mean, it was topical then, and it almost feels more topical now.
I was excited because I also love this movie, and we'll get into like why we love this movie maybe a little bit more. Definitely the Clooney performance in this is just, I think it's his top three. We both have our thoughts as far as where exactly it'll go. I don't want to spoil it just yet. That's amazing. The film itself is just so well directed. It's really crisp. It cuts through. It's super fast. Like I was just watching it again last night. I was kind of surprised at how fast the movie flowed. It's just so smooth, right? But in terms of this podcast and like how Historians of the Movies has evolved over the last 4.5 years, the big question I've got, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, is this a history movie? And I'm just kind of watching for these moments in time. And oh my gosh, you see this film is such a product of 2008, 2009. It's really, watching it for that alone is just, it's really something else, I kept wrestling with this idea as I was watching this about time and also the transportation, and then thinking about our own professions. And you and I have had these kind of conversations. In fact, I think it's one of the hallmarks of when you and I really kind of stopped being kind of colleagues and were friends, and we were talking very much about maybe the ephemerality of place in our own professions, and the fact that, you're often kind of taken places you don't expect to be. In fact, you had kind of alluded to this a moment ago. You were at a different position other than Oregon, I think, when this came out. And certainly I've lived in Wichita, Minneapolis, and now Florida. So I'm kind of wondering, for people who are unfamiliar with like what historians go through, I think maybe there's this idea that we come through and then we go through graduate school and then we pick the school that we're going to go to and we're going to be there for 30 years. What you've had some different experiences like that. Could you kind of like speak maybe your own parallels towards being in the airplane, figuring out where the next stop is, maybe going from graduate school to I guess maybe all the way up landing in Oregon, or even right now where you're at in California?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things I didn't quite understand was just how dependent I'd be on wherever a job happened to be advertised. I knew that there would be some moving around. I knew that there would be some, choices that had to be made in terms of, do I have to choose a place I like more than the job I like? Now, those choices are even fewer and fewer as there are fewer and fewer jobs, right? And so that the fact of this profession is that we have to move where the job is. And unlike my friends who went to medical school or who are engineers or who are accountants or one of the, they get to choose roughly where they live. So if you're going to practice medicine, you can sort of say, I'm going to live in, fill in the blank, and you practice medicine there. It's not infinite choice, but it's certainly far more. And so I ended up going to graduate school in Northern California. And then I was fortunate enough to get a postdoc in Virginia. And then after that, I went back to Utah for a position. And then that opportunity came to go back to William and Mary. And so I took it, even though I really wanted that job. I really did not want to live in Virginia. I love my colleagues there. I don't think I'll ever have a job I love more than that. It was kind of the perfect blend of teaching really serious undergraduates and working with graduate students. But I did not want to live in Virginia. And I knew that because I'd lived there for 2 years on my postdoc. But I did it anyway because professionally it really made sense. And for various members of my family, it made sense. And so we did it. And then various things happened in my life and I needed to get back west. In fact, I really had some family demands that were to the point where I kind of had to make the choice. Am I going to stay with this profession or am I going to have to find someone or some other way to make a living out west because I needed to be there for my family? And I was very fortunate to get this job. And so there's no complaining happening here. But the reality is, I did spend 3 years commuting back and forth between the East Coast and the West. And then I settled in to the job in Oregon. But then, of course, to have a fellowship, it means you need to go somewhere. So, once I kind of finally got my youngest off to college, the nest is empty and I'm free now, finally, after 20 years of being in the profession, to go do a residential fellowship. And so I was able to do that this year. So all of that to say, I've been very fortunate in this profession. I have nothing but gratitude for like what I've been able to enjoy in this profession. But it has cost quite a bit in terms of feeling rooted, in terms of feeling at home. So I really, in some ways, maybe it's because I really relate to this rootlessness that the Clooney character is experiencing. And, he embraces it. He turns it into an ideology. But then you see toward the end of the film that he really is letting that sort of protective armor break, sort of the scales of it fall away, because deep down he really wants to have that connection.
There was that one very heavy scene where he receives the image of his sister and her fiance, and he's got to take it around the country, and it quite literally does not fit in his suitcase, right? It doesn't fit in his world, does not fit into his life. It's just obvious as that. And, he goes home to see his family, and they're like, we don't even know you. He's trying to be this guy, and he finally does get his opportunity to be that guy. But it's his career and life has kind of taken him away from that. I think that's certainly something that I felt or continue to feel living in Florida or anywhere else my career might take me, because I'm probably never going to go back to rural Western Kentucky, and that's just
right.
That's part of the trade-off for this. And, I talk to other graduate students as people are coming up and things like that. I'm like, look, brace yourself. This is a very ephemeral business that we're in. The people you're going to go to graduate school, you're going to see a whole lot of for 2 years, and then you're going to see them 4 times at a conference the rest of your life. And that's the way, that's the name of the business. So understand that's kind of the life of a historian, at least in my own experience.
Yeah. And I really like what you mentioned about the photograph of his sister and brother-in-law not fitting into his life, like literally, it's poking out of his suitcase. And, he finds that to be such an annoyance, that it's such an imposition, because he has chosen, it seems to me like he chose that he didn't try to balance the connection and the movement, or the rootedness in the movement. He just cut everything else off. And so, this small favor that he's asked to do, which should be just an obvious, easy thing to do, he finds it so burdensome because it's sort of emblematic of that bigger set of commitments that he's chosen to just sort of step aside from.
Now, you said you would spend a lot of time actually. So, Ryan, the character, he loves being in the air, right? There's that moment when, he's like, where are you from? He's like, I'm from here. I can't say. Yeah. What about you? You've flown all over the place. I just saw you were up in like Montana or someplace else, flying around, like taking just the world's most ungodly gorgeous pictures. Do you like to fly?
I actually do, but under some circumstances. So, that year, or those 3 years when I was commuting across the country just for my family, I came to really hate flying, because it was, I loved being there, but having to get up at 3, drive to the airport, go through Atlanta, go to Portland. Once you fly a lot, you get perks, right? I've never been able to afford buying a first class ticket, but occasionally you get bumped up to first class if it's a super early flight and it's pretty empty. And that kind of flying anyone would like, because you're sitting in this giant reclining seat. I don't recline, by the way, just for the record. I'm not one of those people.
You and I are very much on the record about this, and I think about this often when I get on the plane, about our manifesto here that thou shalt not lean back.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is, in the novel that this movie is based on, there's a scene where the author has the one of the characters recline, and the author has this little, what's clearly like his own commentary, and it was like taking the space to which she's entitled. And I'm just like, yeah, this is not my kind of guy. Anyway, so, but you're in this giant, extra wide seat with all the legroom you could need. They bring you actual food. They're always attentive. And so that kind of flying, which is the flying that Ryan Bingham does in the film, man, seems all right. You can read a book, you can work on your laptop, you can watch a movie, whatever you want. And that's a pretty comfortable way to spend a few hours. Most of the time, though, you're sitting in like my knees are pressed against the seat in front of me. And, I just had shoulder surgery this summer. So I'm like trying to, manage how do I prop my shoulder in a way that it's not aching. And that can get really tedious. And that's how the vast majority of people fly who fly at all, right? So I don't think that they really address that very well in the movie, just how his life of, going into all the fancy hotels and going into the concierge lounge or whatever. It's a certain brand of flying.
No, let me tell you something. I remember I had kind of lucked out and got into my first time I flew first class. And I remember I'm sitting there and I remember the attendant comes by and says, "Would you like something to drink?" I was like, "Oh, I can have anything I want." It's like, yes, I would. And there's like, after that, I was like, "Oh, I should just fly first class all the time. That should be the standard. Like, why have I not been flying first? Oh, it's right, because I can't afford it." But once you tasted that, I was like, "Oh, I've got to talk myself into first class as many times as possible." And I had been able to do it. I bet it was easier pre 9/11. There's definitely like a 9/11 aspect to this film.
Absolutely.
There's a part where he's like randomly selected for, as he's going through and he's kind of stereotyping everybody who's in line going through security, right? There's a very real commentary on who's flying and why. And it doesn't reveal nice things about Ryan Bingham, except for the fact that he's unapologetic about his stereotyping, right? He's like, it's faster.
It's faster, right?
And his whole thing is speed. It's like, how fast can I get through this? I was going to ask you, do you I've got my own well-known established flying routine, and Bingham does too. And I was kind of wondering, do you just get on the plane and go, or do you have a thing that you do? Do you have certain clothes that you wear when you fly? Do you do a thing? What do you do?
So when I was traveling a lot, I had everything down. So I had like a whole second set of all my toiletries, for example, a whole that I just kept in the bag, and I had certain clothes I traveled with, and and I had a certain routine of what I do in the morning. And one of the interesting things I realized is that this had become such a crutch for me that one time I carpooled to the airport with somebody, and we were talking, and so I missed a couple bits of my routine. One of which is when I get out of the car at the long-term parking lot, I take a photo of where my car is, because there's no chance I'm going to remember. Zero chance.
Never.
And so I didn't do that because I was talking. It's another historian, Eric Hinderaker. We were traveling together. And so I got in the car, I got in the, in the shuttle, and I forgot to do that picture. And I came back, separately. And I realized when I'm on the shuttle, I have no idea where I am. And this is a massive long-term parking lot, and it's snowing. And one of the things I often do is wear shorts on the plane because I'm always too hot on a plane. And I, get there and get off the shuttle at some random spot that seems to be in the middle and just start wandering aisles. And the snow has fallen enough that the cars aren't really visible, so you can see the shape of the car, but not the color. You can't see the license plate. So I'm walking around pushing the, lock button just to see if I can see some lights flashing through the snow. I did that for an hour and a half, and finally some security guard came and picked me up and drove me around. We finally found the car, and I was like, it was maybe the last time I really loved flying, because it was done after that. It was not the best night of my life. So there are routines, and when they get interrupted, something usually either I forget something or I lose my car.
Yeah, it sounded like you had a 90-minute lesson in never forgetting to take your picture.
Absolutely. I've never forgotten again. That's true.
Yeah, you only do it and I do the exact same thing, right? And but now, and I used to have this thing, I used to be absolutely terrified of flying. So I had this entire routine, which was really at first complain for the week ahead of time to my wife at the time, which is probably why she's my wife at the time. She's out here listening. She'll laugh at this because she knows, I was just the world's most obnoxious, terrified flyer. And then I got to where I would watch the same movie the night before I would fly. And then because I had to watch this movie, Riding Giants, documentary history of the big wave surfing, right? And then I would always do this covert thing as I'm getting on the plane where I just kind of rub my hand and kiss it and then smack the fuselage as I'm walking in. People think I'm crazy. I am batting 1,000. I have always arrived at my destination, and it's because of my eccentricities. I know this.
Yeah, it's like an athlete having those routines.
You know what? It's amazing. And I remember I eventually stopped doing those things. But that first time that I flew, where I was consciously like, okay, I'm not going to watch the movie, I'm not going to do my little thing, I was so nervous because I had become dependent on that.
Right.
But the interesting is, like, once I let go of all that stuff, like, I actually got to where I went from being absolutely terrified of flying. No one likes going through security, and God knows we don't like being stuck in the garage afterwards. And I don't even know what snow is after living in Florida as long as I have. But the process of being in the air. One of the cool things about this film and that I love are those shots of the city.
Yeah, isn't it great?
Oh, it's so peaceful. It's like what you see, and I remember because I lived in Wichita for about 5 years, and Wichita, Kansas does not get a lot of, there's not a lot of people talking about Kansas, and it's an amazing little town, but like, I remember like, oh, that's actually Wichita. When they flew over it, I was like, oh, I pointed out, I recognized the town. It was just such a cool little effect of that film, although there's inevitably, I got to warn you, there's going to be somebody after I've seen Twitter as long as I have now that's going to take real problems with you classifying Kansas as the Midwest. It's like,
that's right.
Whole, like, does Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma, do they count as the Midwest?
That's a good question. I think that depends on what part of them, right? I mean, if you drive across Kansas, which I've done a ridiculous number of times, going between the West Coast and Virginia.
You drove that?
Oh, I've driven it about 8 times.
Oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, with moving trucks a couple of times. But yeah, you drive across Kansas and there's a moment where you're very clearly, you're in the rolling hills, things are green, and then things get brown. And then there's a moment where you start to see the Rockies rise up. If you're on I-70, or I think it's I-70 or 64. Yeah. It's 70, I-70.
70.
Yeah. So, and you see the Rockies just start to rise up, like as you're approaching Colorado. And it's just stunning. You're like, okay, this is unambiguously the West.
Oh yeah.
But if you're in this sort of rolling hills, soybean and corn country, I don't know. Who knows? We could have regionalism is a big argument in history, right? We always argue about is it the history that makes it the West or the East? Is it or the Midwest rather? Is there some cultural element? Is it the environment?
All right. Well, let me ask you this then: where's New France?
There's a wonderful essay on this written by Alan Greer and Kate Debarras. And it's essentially the title of the essay. It's in French, but it's essentially like, what is New France? So essentially their argument is, and I think I'm pretty persuaded by it, that it's used historically several different ways. Early on, like in the 16th century, New France is used as an argument to claim territory against Iberian empires. So, French people in the 16th century call Florida New France. They would call Florida, a part of New France. So, they say this. I was just reading a narrative earlier today where
is it the Huguenot?
Yeah. Well, so this is Laudonnière, the famous narrative of the 3 voyages to Florida in the 16th century, and he has a whole section. I'd forgotten about it. He has a whole section where he discusses, there are 3 parts of the Americas. One is called New France. One is called New Spain. One is called Peru. And he lays out the sort of geographic distinctions. And then he tosses in Brazil at the end, but kind of wants to forget about that because France has just lost Brazil a few years ago. But yeah, so in the 17th and 18th centuries, though, that kind of narrows. And so New France eventually becomes essentially what we'd call Quebec today, with a little bit more of maybe parts of Ontario. Sometimes Acadia and what's now Nova Scotia are included in New France. So Canada. And then Louisiana is seen as something separate once it becomes a separate colony. So when I say New France, like in my book title, I'm really talking about that because it's mostly a sort of 18th century book. It's really talking about Canada, roughly, although it does deal with the Mississippi Valley and, sort of Illinois country.
It's that aspect's always really interesting me because, I was just explaining, I always tell the story about the Cajun and the crawfish and the Acadian expulsion. And I take on this obnoxious Cajun accent that I blew out of proportion from my time growing up in Brobridge. But, this French history, I think is really important to dig. Even this idea of like New France becomes really important to this understanding, even in the United States. I'm kind of wondering, like, do American historians have a lot to gain by understanding like New France? Or do you get feedback mostly from people who are interested in Canadian history? I mean, where are people digging in with your own work?
Yeah, I think it's both. So the idea of early American history that has been dominant over the past, say, 20 years is to try to treat the period on its own terms, right? To try to say, we're not going to use this as a way to talk about pre-United States history only, but we're going to talk about, what Karen Wolf has termed vast early America, right? This idea that early America as a field, certainly, and I think that grows out of how people experienced being in the early modern Americas, doesn't respect those boundaries that came much later, right? So if you're in Michigan and you're in let's say you're in an indigenous, an Anishinaabe village or something, you don't think you're in New France or the United States because you aren't, right? You're in your own territory. But if you're in a French mission settlement nearby, you might say you're part of New France. The idea of the United States doesn't exist, right? And so it makes more sense for them to conceptualize their experience, their life, their political requirements and obligations and limitations and possibilities all fit within that different geographic frame. And so, if we're really going to understand early America, we have to understand French colonization. We have to understand the indigenous people who, were by far the dominant force in what the French called New France. So they're big maps that sort of say New France. If you zoom in, you also see like all the indigenous villages, and they'll say like Pays des Iroquois, which is like the country of the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee country. And so I think that that's really essential. So when I teach early U.S. history, I teach the U.S. survey almost every year, and because we're on quarter system, my course goes up to about 1815 ish. So the vast majority of time I'm talking, the U.S. doesn't exist. And so I don't use those boundaries to frame it. That said, there is a real deep interest in the history of slavery in Canada that has really kind of crystallized in the last just couple of years. There's been a lot more people turning, and by people I mean not just scholars. I mean the public, school teachers, writers, newspapers, really interested in the history of slavery in New France. And so it's been really interesting to work with people who are trying to reach those the publics that are interested. So, for example, I worked with an Anishinaabe artist in Montreal by the name of Emily Monet, who wrote a podcast and who produced a podcast and wrote a play about an enslaved Indigenous woman that I'd written about in my book. Her name's Marguerite Duplessis, and it was produced in Montreal. The podcast is linking that history to the history of modern, problems like missing and murdered Indigenous women, this epidemic of human trafficking that happens and that targets disproportionately Indigenous women. And so we worked on, we talked a lot about this history together. I shared sources, and in the end, the work was her own. I'm not, claiming any credit for it, but it was really gratifying to see someone who is this creative and this just so brilliant and also deeply invested because of her own experience and her own identity. To see that work be useful in some way was really gratifying. There's another example in Toronto. There are two artists, Camille and Kamal, they style themselves, and they did a giant installation in Union Station in Toronto where they depicted the household of one of the sort of founding fathers of Toronto, one of the founding families of Toronto. And that family had 18 enslaved individuals that they claimed as their property. And this installation shows like all the hustle and bustle of this train terminal. And then there are 18 individuals that are in focus. Everyone else is blurred. And then they produced biographies of each of those 18 individuals. And so I was able to be a participant in that and contribute some of the research that I'd done and then do a lot of new research, which I hadn't done. And just to see that in the busiest train station in Canada, I'm pretty sure it is, all these people are having an opportunity to engage this part of their past that they usually sort of don't think about. They think about themselves in opposition to the United States. We were the free spot at the end of the Underground Railroad. We take pride in that. And it turns out that there's, a huge story in the sort of roots of their nation that has to be grappled with. And so I think it's both. There's plenty of interest among early American historians. There's plenty of opportunity to teach students that the early history of the U.S. is sort of deeply influenced by French colonization. And then also that Canada as a national history as well is trying to grapple with this.
Well, I've got a question for you as far as this, because the thing that keeps popping in my head right now, one of the big aspects of this particular film that we watched, right, are these, these conversations that Clooney's having with the people who he's having to let go. And so much of what we do as historians is really kind of having these conversations with the past, or at least that's kind of what I envision I'm trying to do, is talk to these folks who belong to the past, but also the present, right? Who lived in a different time and era, and kind of maybe bring them forth in the stories. And I'm kind of wondering, like, reading your work and sitting here talking to you, it sounds like such a daunting thing to sit here in the 21st century and say, okay, let me go figure out something as heady as indigenous slavery in New France 300-400 years ago, right? How do you have those conversations? Like, how do you do that? Where do you go? How do you go back and like reconstruct these lives from the archive and so forth? It sounds like to me, being familiar with your work, I've seen it, but it's like, how do you do that? Take me through the process of like, for the book, or where did you go and start, and how do you just dive into that? Because to me, it sounds like such an incredible process of like, almost overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. It's overwhelming. And I have to say that, the work I did would not have been possible without generations of work before that. So, there was a historian, Marcel Trudel, a Quebecois historian who, for most of his career, taught at the University of Laval in Quebec City. And he, in 1960, back long before these conversations were being had in Canada, he published this book about slavery in French Canada. And he was absolutely pilloried for it by his Quebecois colleagues, because it was a critique of French colonialism. And there was a lot invested at that moment when there was a very real problem in Canada with anti-Quebecois discrimination. Very serious problem. And I don't want to minimize that in any way. And so there were a lot of people who felt that, like, doing this at this moment, when what we really need is to like stop getting fired because of our French accents, or stop being called, ridiculous names, or, stop being discriminated against in, housing, and on and on. They're saying, well, this isn't the moment when we want to really sort of say, hey, our ancestors were violent and racist just like yours. There was a lot invested in the story that the French were the nice colonizers and the British were the bad colonizers. There was this thing they call the conquest, which is just the end of the 7 Years' War. It's the end of a war that, like a lot of times, territory changes places. And so Trudel had done a massive amount of work, and that means going through parish registers, going through court records. So that served as a foundation of what I started on and could work on. And so I could not have done my work without that. That said, it was work written in 1960 by someone who still was pretty cautious about being critical of French colonization. And so there was a lot to be done to sort of figure out what's happening on the indigenous side, to figure out, what are the lives of these people actually like, not in some schematic argument, but, an individual kind of way. And so for me, I guess the process really was trying to reconstruct the contours of this system through individual lives. So if I could find someone, let's say, who was enslaved in the Midwest and, sold to various French proprietors through Michilimackinac, maybe through Detroit, then maybe to Montreal, then Quebec City. In fact, Marguerite, who is the one who Emily Monet did the podcast and play about, this was her experience. You could kind of trace through this freedom suit that she brought up where she'd been. And then that tells you, like, okay, this is a little bit how the system works. This is how a trade works. You find a contract here or a lawsuit there. You find some nuns who sue somebody because they rented out their slave to them and the nuns didn't get paid, so they sue their neighbor. And then there's a little snippet of paper that tells you that these nuns, first of all, they own slaves. And second of all, they weren't afraid to take someone to court for not paying their rent on this human being. which again, a little sort of telling tidbit. Ultimately, I guess it was just really this commitment that what I really found most interesting was the lived experience of the enslaved and feeling like they had the least voice of anyone in this system. And so I was most interested in their voices. And in some ways, it's a little bit like what, Jason Reitman was doing when he did these interviews, when he wrote that into the screenplay, that, a lot of those people that are interviewed in this film are actually people who'd lost their jobs. I mean, there's the Zach Galifianakis and J.K. Simmons and some other people who play those characters. But several of them were people who'd recently lost their jobs. And you can really see the emotion. And remember, at the end of the film, they start asking them a little bit more about their experience. And so that, to me, also is just a really moving part of this, where you just have very real, raw emotion.
This is what I get in return for 30 years of service for my company. And they send some yo-yo like you in here to try to tell me that I'm out of a job. They should be telling you you're out of a job.
You have a lot of gall coming in here and firing your number one producer, and then you're going to go home tomorrow and make more money than you've ever made in your life, and I'm going to go home without a paycheck. Fuck you.
I guess you'd leave me dumbfounded. I don't know where this is coming from. How am I supposed to go back as a man and explain this to my wife that I lost my job?
On a stress level, I've heard that losing a job is like a death in the family. But personally, I feel more like the people I worked with were my family, and I died.
I can't afford to be unemployed. I have a house payment. I have children.
I don't know how you can live with yourself, but I'm sure that you'll find a way while the rest of us are suffering.
How do you go forward when you've lost your job? Maybe you're in your 50s. You don't feel like you're going to get another job. This is the best thing you've ever had. What are your kids going to think of you? Mm-hmm. And so it's those same kind of questions that you really want to understand what makes someone tick, what they do to manage the hardships and challenges that they're facing.
Yeah, I actually feel like that was like some of the most powerful parts of the film. Like, of course you got to have J.K. Simmons in there and Galifianakis, but like the folks who you had probably never seen before on film, that's where it was really resonating and was like the most natural part of that, right? And you're just like, right, and you're right. It's like those moments almost kind of exist like the archive, right? Where you're you've got these little snippets, these little moments around, and you're just trying to build an entire world around and say, look, I don't know exactly what's happening here, but here's what I think based on everything else. Looking at this film like an artifact, how do you tell the story of the woman in Wichita or anyone else?
Yeah, the woman who ended up jumping off a bridge, right? I mean, there's this moment, when she looks at them very calmly and says, I know exactly what I'm going to do. There's a beautiful bridge by my house and I'm going to go jump off it. And then he's sort of awkwardly trying to reassure, his colleague, they never do it, it's going to be fine. And then of course that's what happens. It's one of these things where those things actually were happening. Desperation was hitting people. They were losing homes, they were losing jobs. And it is just a moment of reality. And I think you're right that it was a brilliant move as a filmmaking decision, but much more important than that to me was that it was this little sort of mini archive that's created. Apparently, they did a bunch of interviews, and I think they're available somewhere. I would love to be able to take a peek at those sometime.
We speak about the reality of that. I do want to listen for people who are listening. I lived in Wichita for 5 years. If you jump off a bridge in Wichita, you're going to fall about 5 or 6 feet, okay, into the Arkansas River. They actually call it the Arkansas River in Wichita. You're going to suffer a nasty ankle sprain, but that is a bit of myth making that there are bridges in Wichita you could hurt yourself on. You might have a limp for a little bit, but when I was watching, I was like, no, you've never been to Kansas. That's just not what that river does at all. That river is about 18, 20 inches deep. We were talking though about this film versus the novel. How does this compare?
It's really interesting. So I read the novel for this, actually. I just got curious. The author, Walter Kern, is, I'd read some of his essays, which I really quite enjoy. There's one in particular that came out when Mitt Romney was running for president. And Kern writes this essay about his falling away from Mormonism and, his wrestle with this. And, I could relate to this. I grew up Mormon and no longer practicing. And so there was something about that that really resonated with me. And what struck me when I read the book is that Mormonism is all over that book. One of the main characters live in Salt Lake City. He sees Mormon missionaries at the airport. One of his love interests is a Mormon woman who just doesn't tell him she's Mormon. And then he says, oh, she's too weird because she believes that she's going to have her own planets after death. And then there's just reference after reference to it. Some of his family, some of Ryan Bingham's family are Mormon. And so I should say Latter-day Saint, which is what the preference is right now. This is one thing interesting in Latter-day Saint history. There's been these moments where they'd prefer to be called Latter-day Saints rather than Mormons. And in my childhood, I experienced these movements. Like there was someone would make a claim, or make a statement, you should refer to yourself as Latter-day Saints, not Mormons. And that would happen for a while, and then it would fall back into the normal previous rut. And then it would be said again. And right now we're in a recent moment where that's important again. So I apologize to any LDS listeners who take that as being insensitive. But, having grown up in that culture and seen those moves over and over, it just doesn't quite come naturally to me. But anyway, so in the film, you don't have any connection to that at all, right? It's not mentioned. There's no little hints. In fact, what I was struck with, this is going to sound really ungenerous, so I kind of hope Walter Kern doesn't listen to this. Why would he?
Because we're a big deal, you and I.
Of course he's going to tune in, right?
Naturally he's going to tune in. I hope he's listening right now. I'm going to mispronounce his name later.
The author of this major book that becomes an Academy Award-winning film, or Academy Award-nominated film, I guess. Yeah, so he's not going to listen. So I'll just be frank. The book isn't very good. I love his essays. I did not like this book, and it could be that I've watched the movie so many times, I had a set of expectations. But usually when I watch a movie and read a book, the book is so much more satisfying. You have more detail, you have more, but the central story is completely different. I mean, well, his job is the same. He fires people for a living, but frankly, that's kind of peripheral. The relationship with Alex, who is is that her name, right? I should know this after 50 times watching it. It's a passing thing in the book. It's central to how the film unfolds. There is no Anna Kendrick character. There is no discussion of online firing because the book was written, a long time before. And so I think of this like I think of Billy Collins's poem Litany. It just makes me laugh every time.
I watched the link you sent to me and I loved it.
Isn't it just hilarious? So, for those who are unfamiliar with this poem, you watch the YouTube version where Billy Collins reads his poem Litany. And in the lead up to this, he describes what he's doing with it. And he encountered a poem that was like, you are this and you are this, and you're as bright as the sun and as glorious as the stars and as sweet as a rose and blah, blah, blah. And the way he describes it is that it's this wheel spinning exercise, that it's just one thing after another, comparison, it doesn't go anywhere. So he said, what I did was I rewrote it and improved upon it. And then he says, this is done out of courtesy. So you can help someone whose poem has totally failed. And I feel like the writers of the film did this for Walter Kern's novel. And I actually am much more deeply impressed that they wrote this film from this book than if they'd written it from nothing. Because to see the potential of this film in that book takes an amazing amount of imagination. Ryan Bingham, the central character, for example, is just, there's nothing sympathetic about him whatsoever in the book.
No, not at all.
There's no redeeming quality. In the movie, at least, eventually you kind of come to appreciate him, and there's that sort of opening up toward the end where he's sort of coming out of, what the Anna Kendrick character describes as his cocoon of self-banishment. There's just no arc like that for the character in the book. He's just awful, and you just want to get him off the page every time he's talking. And so there's that. And then there's also just not that sense of surprise, because the romantic relationship that's happening between Bingham and, Alex is, at first it's very casual and it's very, transactional. They say they've signed up for the same thing, which is just casual. She has this line, think of me like a man, but with a vagina. And he's just like, this is the best thing ever, because he is, viewing this from a very sort of objectifying and, self-serving perspective. But then as it evolves, there's real intimacy that develops between them. And he starts to feel like, I'm ready to, risk some emotional openness, and has that moment where he says, I've been trying to empty the backpack so that I can know what to put back in it. And that's where he's sort of making this transition. And then they have that time away when they're at the wedding. And the scene at the wedding where they're dancing at the end, and like he puts his jacket over his shoulders, and she's, there's like a real intimacy that is clearly being evoked really effectively by both actors, but also by the script. And then, of course,
should we spoil the film right now?
I think we have to spoil it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think so. Okay. So if you haven't seen a 13-year-old film starring the biggest actor on the planet, at least for a while, pause now. I'm not kidding. Pause. That's enough pausing. We're going to go ahead and talk. We're going to spoil it. So, because this is really going to lead us into what we think, because I want to use this next moment we're going to talk about why this film works and why Clooney works in this movie. And then also maybe we can talk about like our thoughts on Clooney's best performances.
Yeah.
Because I think that what happens at the end of this film might be my single favorite 4 seconds of a Clooney performance in anything I've ever seen.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. So, there's the moment that you start to feel like he is really in, and he's seen, he has this heart to heart with his future brother-in-law where, he has to convince him that life is better with company. Everyone needs a co-pilot, so he's
talking to himself.
Yeah, exactly. He's talking to himself. And he's also he's using the sort of empty rhetoric of Hampton Inn speeches.
Yeah.
And yet it's actually hitting a nerve personally. And then right after that, the next scene is the wedding, where they start having this moment where it's very clearly this turning point for him, where he's feeling ready to risk that kind of intimacy. And then, of course, they part, and she says, "Oh, just call me if you miss me." And he just says, "I miss you," and he gets this impulse. He walks out of his speech at Dos Equis, where he's going to be this speaking engagement he's been dying for. It's this big honor, and he just leaves the podium and goes to surprise her at her home. And you can see that like boyish excitement. This is where Clooney's acting does all the work. Just his face acting, it's just so subtle, and you just see this like twinkle in his eye, and he's just so excited. He's finally like, I'm ready to risk this.
And you're rooting for him, right? Because you're like, this is the turn. This is when it finally goes his way.
Yeah, and where you want him to be rewarded for not sort of pushing everyone aside, and for being willing to have a relationship that isn't just transactional, that isn't just objectifying, and that like he really is ready to have a partner. And then, of course, he shows up to her house, rings the doorbell, and she comes to the door looking terrified, and her kids run up the stairs, and her husband says, "Honey, who's at the door?"
So I was in the neighborhood.
Hey, honey, who's at the door?
It's just somebody who's lost.
But there's this moment where he's standing there, and George Clooney, who you just can't imagine ever being turned down by anyone ever, right? I mean, that's just kind of been his ethos, both on and off screen for years and years and years. And he does the slightest little thing where he's standing there in the cold Chicago weather, and his jaw drops, and it's not a lot. It just kind of falls open, maybe an inch or so. I was watching this last night going, it's such a detailed physical performance where you watch this man's heart explode. He finally, he's like, this whole moment, we've been waiting for him to come and have this, this moment. He can't live without her. And he does, right? He's like, this is it. And this is not the fairy tale. This is actual real life. I think it's why it hits so hard is like, because I think a lot of times we look at personal lives, this, that, and the other, and so forth. And I'm just talking about anybody who's been through any sort of relationships. We go into things hoping that we're going to end up in Richard Gere and Julia Roberts, and she's going to rescue us right back because he's there to rescue her. And she denies him. And it's this moment. It's quiet, and his physically, This is not him swinging a broadsword or anything else like that. It's this quiet little moment where you can just see everything happening. There's only a couple other moments I think he's had on his film career that even match this. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah, I agree. It's the subtlety of it is what makes it, right?
Yeah.
And he carries himself with such confidence. I mean, if I looked like George Clooney, I'd carry myself with confidence too. But alas. But the thing is, there's something about just his posture, his face. It reminded me a little bit of like Elizabeth Moss does this in Handmaid's Tale. There's the face acting where it's just like so subtle, where some sort of like, intensity of the eyes or some sort of like half smile or half smirk or, whatever. And so there's that moment where he does that. And then it shows him on the tram going back to the airport. And then it shows him in the hotel, and these are these places where he says, I'm at home, the recirculated air, all this is my indication that I'm home. And like, his body language is completely broken.
Oh yeah.
And there's that beautiful shot where it's the snow is blowing and the windows on that hotel that kind of stick out in that point, and he's sitting in the window and you can sort of see his silhouette. He's holding a drink and just looking just into the distance. And his cinematography is just beautiful. It's just like this shot where it kind of rises up and catches his despair. He's obviously no longer in this place that he feels home, not just because of this, but his job's ending and whatever. But then he carries it to the end in this way that's just compelling acting. But the other thing that strikes me about this, and I had a long conversation with my editor actually about this. So just as I was turning in my book is when I had first seen this movie, because up to that point I hadn't had time to do anything else. I was trying to get tenure and write my book. And so I turned this in, I watched this movie, and we were at one of these lunches. And Frederica Toita, who is infamous in the field for being kind of scary, terrifying, who, will just tear your writing down if it needs to be torn down, but also just a brilliant developmental editor. And for whatever reason, this film came up. People are asking, what did you do this weekend? And I mentioned I watched it. And Frederica just lit up. She says, I love this movie. And she said the thing that she loved about it so much was that it inverted what you expect of the gender norms. And that the person who was, the philanderer, the person who was deceptive, the person who had been most effective at masking themselves for sexual pleasure was the woman. And that Clooney, the super good looking, whatever, he of course was a womanizer and objectifier. He wasn't a really sympathetic character. But when he's moving toward something more acceptable or sympathetic, he gets his knees cut out from under him by this woman who was kind of what you'd expect him to be. And I thought that was a really interesting insight. And, it kind of did two things for me. One was that I felt like it didn't say great things about me, that it never occurred to me when I watched this movie until the very end that she was married or that she could be.
Never did.
It just didn't even occur to me. And I don't know if that's effective writing. I don't know if it's effective acting. It's probably some of both, but it's also like deeply ingrained gender assumptions on my part. And so Frederica and I had this long conversation about how these assumptions shape everything we do, including our writing. And so we had this conversation about my manuscript that was like, where are my gendered assumptions shaping what I write about? When I write about the relationship between, say, there's a section of the book that talks about marriage and the custom of the country. It's sort of talked about a lot in fur trade literature, à la façon de pays, where they have this sort of country marriage. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I'm trying to make a point is that a lot of those marriages actually involved violence, and not just violence because there's domestic violence, but violence in the sense that the woman is enslaved, and that might shift to something else. It might be sort of fluid in terms of the perpetuation of that slavery, but that much of the sort of marriage and the custom of the country in this region of sort of French colonized Midwest was French colonizers marrying enslaved Native women, who then might take on a role that's somewhat more like what French culture would say is a wife. And so it's very interesting that we had this conversation about my manuscript and about some of the blind spots that I had when writing it through the vehicle of this film and how it kind of revealed our sort of shared gender assumptions. It was really an interesting moment for me.
I've had this thought as you were talking here, and we were talking about the difficulties of like in the archive and so forth. I didn't brief you for this because I didn't think about this till about 4.5, 5 minutes ago when you said something. And I need to try this out. Imagining that we're historians and we're seeing this glimpse of Bingham's life, right? And you're historians and you've got this aspect to know of it. You've got to know him for these couple months. What happens to Bingham after this movie's over? After he gives the miles to his sister and her husband, and he meets Sam Elliott, which is probably the coolest thing ever. Construct, if you will, the life remaining for this man. Does he put himself back out there? Does he retreat back into himself? Does he learn anything from this? What happens to Bingham?
I've wondered that, actually. I've wondered because, this is a fairly new impulse for him, right? And he's sort of just stuck his head out of the turtle shell and it's about to get lopped off. I think the most likely thing would be that he'd return to his jaded, self-serving, shallow connections, right? I mean, because that seems like what people do. If you've been a certain way a long time, you take a risk to make some change, and then it works out really badly. It's a natural human impulse to sort of go back to what has at least kept you feel safe, right? Yeah, she's the reason. So then she could become a narrative for him justifying that isolated and shallow social connection.
I can't lie. Like his whole soliloquy on the whole everyone dies alone bit has stuck with me ever since the very first time I ever watched this film.
You never want to get married.
Nope.
Never want kids.
Not a chance.
Ever.
Never. Is that so bizarre?
Yes. Yes, it is.
I just don't see the value in it. All right, sell it to me.
What?
Sell me marriage.
Okay, how about love?
Okay.
Stability, just somebody you can count on.
How many stable marriages do you know?
Somebody to talk to, someone to spend your life with.
I'm surrounded by people to talk to. I doubt that's going to change.
How about just not dying alone?
Starting when I was 12, we moved each one of my grandparents into a nursing facility. My parents went the same way. Make no mistake, we all die alone. Now, those cult members in San Diego with the Kool-Aid and the sneakers, they didn't die alone. I'm just saying there are options.
I've got to say, one thing about this scene, the everyone dies alone scene, Anna Kendrick cannot fake cry to save her life. She's a fantastic actor. I like a lot of things about her, but in that scene when she says, Ryan, or not Ryan, whoever left, right. What is her boyfriend's name? He left me, and then she does this. It's the worst moment of the movie. Anyway, I had to say that. Although, let me just give a counterpoint to the Bingham aftermath.
Hit me.
Right? Because they do want to suggest that maybe he's changed. Because he does two things, right? One is that he opens this around the world account for his sister. And the whole reason that they did this elaborate thing about taking photos of their photos, like, is it Flat Stanley style,
Yeah.
The reason they do that is because they specifically say we can't afford a honeymoon right now because all of our money is tied up in this turnkey housing investment. But he gives away 1 million miles. And that's something that, really wasn't in his character before. He guarded them so closely. So that's one thing. And then the other is that he writes that very encouraging and glowing letter for his colleague who left after the woman committed suicide and, sends it to the San Francisco law firm or wherever she's going to work. And it's a very heartfelt acknowledgement of someone who meant something to him and, him wanting to do something for her. So those two acts of sort of generosity, or maybe generosity sounds like a little much, but, those two kindnesses that he does for his sister and his former colleague do, I think the filmmakers want to suggest that there's a change. I guess I'm a little more skeptical.
The evidence doesn't say that he's going to change, right? There's a hope, I guess, maybe that there will be. And there's a film that kind of comes to mind when I'm thinking about this that kind of pulls the rug out from underneath you, which is La La Land. I don't know if you've seen that film. I remember wanting to throw everything in my living room across the kitchen into the last 10 minutes of La La Land are the most gutting part of a film I think I've never been so
100%.
angry at a movie and then so thankful for a movie for making me feel like I did. Because I was like, oh my God, La La Land made me feel in ways I haven't felt about it. I mean, I'm sitting here right now talking to you and I'm literally getting shivers thinking about that very first time I watched it. And even now, I cannot watch the very end of La La Land. It hurts too damn much.
It's brutal. I agree. It might be the most sort of searing moment in a film in terms of, so it's that one little line, do 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 do, on the piano, and it just like kicks you. Yeah, it's in some ways it's kind of similar, right? Where there's this hope that things are going to work out, and then there's this sort of deep, deep sense of loss, and this potential that might have been, you realize actually didn't work out at all, and they've both gone different paths, and all of those potential futures that they could have had are just done.
Yeah. But maybe that's what's been preventing Ryan from growing anyway, right? So, you and I both have kids, and one of the things I talk to my boys, my older boy's 14 now, I'm like, look, buddy, you're going to enter into a relationship at some point in time and you're going to get your heart stomped on. And that is necessary for your growth as a human being, right? And maybe that aspect, that shelteredness and the boy, I'm trying to look at this sunny side up right here, but it's like maybe he needs that hero's quest of getting defeated to move forward in his life. And what you're actually seeing is not that part of his life, but just he has to get trampled on first before he can move on. And what we're not seeing is the moving on, if we're looking at the positive aspect, right?
Yeah. But I mean, there's somebody on Twitter asked at some point, what is the most heartbreaking scene of a film that you can think of off the top of your head? And, that's clearly what came to my mind, but it came to a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, it's rough. We love Clooney in this movie. I don't think Clooney gets enough respect as an actor because it's so effortless for him. But I want to hear your thoughts. 3 performances by Clooney. You had said this is what your favorite of his performances? It
is. It's my favorite. I mean, but I don't know how to separate that from it being on my favorite film, right? So you tell me your 3.
Well, this is one of them. It has to be because it's just too damn good. The other 2, I go back and forth. There's a film, the performance here, I think reminds me in a lot of ways. It's a different kind of a thing, but it's Michael Clayton. I think he's absolutely phenomenal in Michael Clayton. I think Michael Clayton I was tweeting earlier today, that last scene between him and Tilda Swinton, that showdown, the whole, does it look like I'm negotiating? And then that final, like during the credits where he's just sitting in the cab and is just driving. I mean, Michael Clayton is Clooney like you've never seen him. You're used to seeing Clooney as the cocky winner, the guy who who's going to win. And this guy's a guy who's constantly getting his teeth kicked in. He's a fixer. He's not this is another film where he's not necessarily a likable guy, right? I think he's phenomenal, Clayton. And then the other film that's nothing like any of the rest of them is Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Yeah, it's
such a hammy, film. Silly thing.
It's so hilarious. How's my hair?
Yeah, I think his signature role is Danny Ocean. But if I got to say his 3 best performances are Up in the Air, Michael Clayton, and Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good top 3. The only one that competes with that
it's Batman.
I think I might put in, that's got to be it. No, actually, it was The Descendants. Maybe it's the sad roles. I don't know, but where he's vulnerable. But, one of the things I was going to mention about Michael Clayton and Up in the Air is that he does very well when he's paired with an incredibly strong woman as his counterpart. I mean, Tilda Swinton's performance in Michael Clayton was just off the charts good. And I think she made him better.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So she made him a lot better. I'd say the same for Vera Farmiga, who was, charming and disarming and all the kind of things you need to be, but also just like her quips were timed perfectly. And she was, at the end, just ruthless.
My hot take is she's the best part of The Departed.
Oh, yeah, I think that's probably right.
I think she's phenomenal. Like, she's just so good.
She's a great actor. And, so I think that, Michael Clayton, the same thing is true of Tilda Swinton, right? She makes him a lot better. And he has this ability to be vulnerable in the face of these, really outstanding performances. But, Oh, Brother Art Thou, I mean, how's my hair? And we're in a tight spot. I mean, how many times have we all quoted Clooney in those settings? I don't know. This is actually, we got to tie this to graduate school. So when I was really struggling with prepping for comps because,
as we all are.
I had.
Can you explain to people who have nenever gone through graduate school as a historian, the fear of comps?
Oh yeah, what is comps? So it stands for comprehensive exams. And, they're a little bit different everywhere. But, in my case, I had 3 exam fields and then an outside field where we did an essay and a syllabus that was a separate thing. But 3 fields, there were, early American history, 19th century U.S. history, and 20th century U.S. history. And in each case, I had about 100 plus books and many more articles on each list. So you're walking into an exam where we had a 4-hour written exam, so an hour and 20 minutes per essay, 3 essays on 300 books, and they could give you anything they wanted to. So you walk into these essays, and then we had an oral exam that was a defense of those, so they would read them and then come back and grill you, but they could grill you on anything else too. Mm-hmm. So, I was stressed out. I had taken a risk. I'd had a different career. I had 3 kids.
How old were you?
And I went back to grad school. So I had kids young. And so I started grad school when I was 27.
You never told me this.
Yeah. And my youngest, who is now 23, was born 2 months before, moved to Davis for grad school. And, I felt like there's just a lot of pressure. And what if I fail? What if I've, done this and it doesn't work out? All these kind of things. And so I was really just in my head. And my just lifelong best buddy from grad school, Ken Miller, great historian of the American Revolution, wrote a great book called Dangerous Guests about prisoners of war in the American Revolution. But more than that, he was just a great friend. And so he came and rescued me one night and took me to see Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? And we saw it in the theater. And we laughed so hard. And it just absolutely saved me for comps because I came back feeling like I was renewed, feeling the benefit of friendship and, then just this absolutely hilarious movie that itself was like a great historical satire, right? So anyway, that's a little aside. But
so you're saying you and your friend had bonds of alliance?
We did, but the bonds were somewhat different. Yeah.
I want to ask you, pulling this back into a sense of history-esque, right? And this travel's such a big part of this. And you and I actually love teaching teaching the survey course. It's one of my favorite things.
Yeah, same.
It's spread out and so forth. I focus on early North America, and you get me into the 1920s, and I love rocket, just going 1920s, 30s, 40s. It's so far beyond what I write about, and I just love it. So whereas we haven't really talked about transportation in either of our works, I wanted to ask you about this because planes are such a big deal. 3 movies in a book. What do you like transportation-wise?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this. So, Airplane came to mind.
Naturally.
Just because it's hilarious, but that's a little on the nose. I really have a soft spot for travel. So if we're talking about travel in the broad sense,
yeah,
absolutely. I would say Stand By Me.
Nice call.
It's not travel these are kids traveling the distance they can travel, right? They're on this sort of clandestine journey to find a body. But it's all about, it really has all the elements of the sort of road trip movie.
I'm thinking railroad tracks. I have a scene in my head right now, railroad tracks.
Absolutely. The railroad tracks, they're trying to get across this trestle, this bridge. And, so that's one that came to mind that maybe it doesn't quite fit the category exactly, but I think I'm going to make an argument for it. And again, when I think about that, it's because of it's about friendship. It's also about, these struggles. Do we belong? They had this whole discussion about what is Goofy. Pluto's a dog, Mickey's a mouse. What is Goofy? And, really deep down, this is a question about where they fit and how are they categorized. And anyway, so whatever. That's a little ponderous for a movie about kids. But there it is. And then I think I'm going to have to go with Throw Mama from the Train instead of Airplane.
Okay.
Mostly because every time I sit down to write, if ever I'm stuck, all I can think about is the night was sultry. And I want to murder that woman who's in my head telling me, like, so easily and obviously the words I can't come up with as I'm struggling to write. So for whatever reason, that image and that voice, they haunt me.
She's firmly ingrained in my head in the Goonies. I mean, just end of story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which has a ship, therefore is a transportation film, right?
Yeah.
What about books? Do you got anything that you like to?
So I got one more. I've only got 2 movies there. So Throw Mama, Stand By Me. The other one is Black Robe. So Black Robe, it's so for those who aren't familiar with the movie, it started out as a novel by Brian Moore. Brian Moore is a novelist who he wrote maybe 50 books. He's a really prolific novelist, and they were all dealt with issues of sort of intercultural tension, intercultural understanding, misunderstanding, violence. He wrote a really great one that is called The Magician's Wife, and it's based in a real story when the French crown sends to North Africa this magician to wow the sort of Muslims with sort of the power of Christianity. And so he's this magician that can do all these sort of just visual deceptions. And he brings his wife with him, and she ends up having a relationship with one of the Muslim diplomats. And so these are the kind of books he writes. And Black Robe is one of his novels that follows an actual historical journey from Quebec to the Huron country in the early 17th or the sort of early to mid 17th century, 1630s. And it traces the lives of this Jesuit who's at the heart of it. And he is having these struggles. He's sort of this fundamentalist religious figure, but also having some self-doubts because he sees that people are dying of disease. The people he's trying to help, he's not really helping. And so he has this crisis of faith that also follows this servant, this guy who travels with him, who's a French guy who wants mostly to get out there and learn native languages and become a fur trader or a coureur de bois. And then this native family, it's a father and a daughter who are, sort of central to this other side. It deals with captivity and it deals with, the effects of colonialism. And in the book version, the internal struggle of the Jesuits a lot more clear than it is in the film. But, the film has all kinds of problems, right? It does all the things that you kind of wish it wouldn't do in terms of sensationalizing native violence, but not quite having the same focus on French colonial violence. But it does make a real effort at having, native actors play native characters. They speak native languages. And there's a lot of sort of rumination about the effects of colonialism. It's seen by the native allies who say, yeah, we've become too dependent on these goods. We really aren't sure this has been the right decision to ally with you. You see it in the sort of enemies who, don't quite know what their choices are in terms of attacking or not. And, you see it in this Jesuit who's just like loses his ability whatsoever to even pray because he sees the destruction that his people are like bringing into this world. So it's really, I've taught this film a lot. And anyway, it's a movie about a journey, a specific journey that is historical, but then fictionalized. So.
And by the way, I remember I was exposed to Black Robe as an undergrad, maybe a graduate student by my advisor, Robert Owens at Wichita State. And, he assigned that and, we picked it apart and so forth. But I think it's an incredible film. We don't get a lot of films that focus, or a lot of big budget films, certainly, that focus on that particular era and those particular topics. Right. So, just like a book, it's going to be problematized and so forth. But I think even with those problems, that's your opportunity as the instructor or as the historian to step in and say, okay, what's going on here and why, right? What part of the stories are being sensationalized, and you have that opportunity to use even those moments as, here, students, what's going on here, right? Why are we seeing this? What are the directions of, say, the producer or the actors or so forth, what they're doing here, and why is that maybe contrary to what may or may not have happened?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great vehicle in for that. And, for me, just it's becoming more common, with TV series that, like Reservation Dogs or, even Rutherford Falls or other things like that. And then there's a lot more film that's being made by Indigenous writers or actors, directors. Yeah. So I guess where I'm going with that is that, Black Robe wouldn't really pass muster when you compare it to what's happening in Native cinema right now. It's so much better what's being done right now. And there are things that you sort of see and you cringe at. But for the early 90s, and it's one of the very few films that shows something that I've actually, written about, New France and Native history. So, I give that caveat only because I don't want it to sound like it's an endorsement for the whole package, right? It's just much more about like this was one of the earliest. And, when you compare it to a film like Dances with Wolves, which came out just a few years before, it's so much more sophisticated and so much more complex in how it deals with colonialism and violence and disease and all these other things that, you get the romanticized version in Dances with Wolves. And, it's just not very satisfying. And so I think that, it might feel that way if we were to put Black Robe up against, sort of more recent Native cinema. It might feel the same way. I'm not sure. But anyway, so the book that I would pick is actually one of my favorite novels. And I don't know that it's totally defensible as a favorite novel.
Go on.
But Ivan Doig's Dancing at the Rascal Fair. Ivan Doig is a Montana author. Well, I guess he has a PhD in history. He's a novelist who's written a lot about the West. And so he wrote this trilogy set in Montana, in the 19th century and then early 20th century. Dancing at the Rascal Fair is the sort of earliest in the chronology. And so it's about these Scottish immigrants who come to Montana to do mostly sheep herding. And part of it is about the sort of recreation of this landscape and there's an unrequited love interest there that's really interesting. And then there's just a lot of really elegant sort of descriptions of landscape that because, I love Montana. I love the West and the Rockies.
It's hard
so
not
there's
to.
Yeah, really it is.
People ask me about what Montana looks like. And I'm like, it looks like what you imagine it to look like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you were mentioning the photos I put up, on social media this last week. The conference I went to was the Front Range Early American Consortium, which is Freaks. Great conference. We've heard some really great papers, especially a lot of graduate students coming up and doing good work. And, Peter Wood did this really interesting thing about the sort of turning knowledge about Stoner Rebellion toward sort of publics. And so he has this, he was there talking about some of this. And anyway, so I was there and, the photos I put up were just things I lifted my iPhone and hit snap. And there was no effort went to it. It's just, that's what it looks like everywhere. It's just stunning. But so Dancing at the Rascal Fair, I think part of it's the visual language. Part of it's the sort of quirky main character. Part of it's this really kind of well-written story of unrequited love that's kind of moving and sad and yet also, just real. But then there are these sort of oblique references to sort of the colonial setting that they're in, right? Even in the later 19th century, right? It's very much native territory. There's all this. It reminds me a little bit about of A River Runs Through It, where you see these little hints of native life and the sort of racism and violence that goes into making this a Scottish sheep herding space. And Doig is not heavy-handed about that, but it's absolutely there. So anyway, those are my answers.
That sounds awesome because I think one of the things once I finished up with my dissertation and was properly knighted as a real grown-up historian, was the fact that I wanted to go back and start reading things that weren't related to my own work, and it's like, so when I talk to folks, I'm like, give me everything you like just about reading, because I feel like really our job as scholars or so forth, it's just the more I can read, the better off I am. And it doesn't have to be history, just the way that the mind is worked, the writing, the construction of the word, the construction of thought on paper. And I enjoy reading, right? So I'd like to hear like what people have the thoughts on. It's great.
It's nice to have time to do the reading that you want to do.
As parents, we have so much time to begin with.
That's right.
We just finished back up with talking about a work of fiction. And I want to come back and talk about this work of fiction, Up in the Air, based on a novel. Ryan Bingham, to our knowledge, doesn't exist. Is Up in the Air a history movie?
Yes, I will say absolutely yes. And I'll say that for two reasons. One is we've both mentioned how well it captures this really transformational moment in American capitalism, right? Where you had this massive housing bubble and everything in the American economy, in fact, the global economy, got caught up in it when that crashed. When the bubble burst, that history of booms and busts is one of the central themes in the history of capitalism, right? And so I think that in this very sort of structural, basic sense, it's one of many examples of how capitalism has this ability to sort of generate potential wealth and seeming wealth, and then just shatter. I'm thinking about Scott Nelson's book, A Nation of Deadbeats, which is this focus on financial panics, mostly in the 19th century. You could find boom and bust cycles in the history of the American West and the history of, American industrial or global industrial history. The other thing, though, is also that it's, I think in some ways it's about the relationship between structures and communities in a sense, right? This sort of, it probes at questions that I ask in my own work a lot, which is, how do you understand this structure, right? He's embedded in a structure. He talks about how, there's that question that Zach Galifianakis asks him, who the fuck are you? I don't know if I can say that on this podcast, but
you absolutely fucking can.
So he says, who the fuck are you, man? Zach Galifianakis is just like, yeah. And then the narrative stops and he says, that's a good question. Who the fuck am I? And then he starts to sort of talk about, and really what his answer really is, he's a cog in this big machine. He's hired by bosses who don't dare fire their own people. And he's, benefiting from, this downturn. And so, there's this moment where the Jason Bateman's character, the boss, is saying like, hey, Big Otto is going to...
Yeah, we haven't had a chance to talk about him.
Yeah, right. I mean, he's just almost he's just bonus.
Gleefully forecasting the downfall of the American economy in 2009. This 2008, I guess, is when they're filming this, and they are rooting for this.
Yeah, and he is just saying, Big Otto's going to lose another 50,000. This is our moment. It's like that. We are here, and so that's it's definitely these structural incentives that are so perverse that this guy makes a living benefiting off others' catastrophes. And there are these reminders of that has its human costs and that has its. So there's that. And then there's also just this question about community and connection versus disconnection. The history of colonization is nothing if it's not a history of mobility and displacement and, some people benefiting off the losses of others. And so, I think it's thematically, it connects to a lot of things I'm interested in my own writing as a historian. But then I also think just in a very real way, it will be an artifact of this moment in the way that like Gone with the Wind is an artifact of the 1920s, or even Birth of a Nation, where it captures this, horrendous thing that's happening. And so it both depicts it and it is a sort of historical primary source in its own right.
Remember when people were using BlackBerries?
Yeah.
Right.
BlackBerries.
And I had this thought, and it's like, is this the first instance? It can't be of sexting on film. Like they're flirting around, joking around. I'm like, that's what's going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to think, when did You've Got Mail, which was the sort of very chaste version of this, right? They were flirting
99-ish,
online.
feels right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was, but they clearly weren't sexting, right? But,
flirty.
Yeah, it was flirty, and it was sort of illicit because they were kind of hiding it from their partners. And, there's explicitly asked the question, is it cheating if it's just online? And, the woman who played Edith Bunker, whose character is she's in the bookstore. She says, well, I can't remember. She says something that's supposed to be shocking, and maybe for 1999 and the internet it was. I don't know, but yeah, it could be. Yeah, it probably isn't.
It's probably, I can't imagine that it is, but it's like, I remember watching it thinking about all these little moments in time where we're seeing where people going through a line, taking off their shoes. This is before TSA pre-check, which is the best $80 I've ever spent in my life. All these different things. I'm watching these films going, oh my gosh, for someone watching this movie in 50, 100 years from now, this is 2009.
Yeah, Chris Hodson, who I just finished this book with, my co-author, who's at BYU. He's a historian, wonderful historian. Speaking of Cajuns, by the way, his first book was called The Acadian Diaspora, and it's all about this forced expulsion. And one of the things that he said very early on, when I first saw this movie, I couldn't shut up about it, so I was talking to everybody about it. And one of the things he said was like, this absolutely should have gotten the Oscar for Best Picture because it will it depicts this moment in time so perfectly, and it will last as a record of this sort of cultural moment. And so he was kind of disappointed that it didn't get the Oscar, but anyway, it won plenty of awards. So.
All right, so we have grounded ourselves in New France. We have grounded ourselves in Wichita and Detroit in this film, Up in the Air. I guess let's bring this for a landing, and I'm going to use every last pun I can while I got you here.
Absolutely.
Brett, Matt, thank you so very, very much for taking the time. I know you're crazy busy over there, and you got the new book coming up, which I'm just geeked out about. Where can people find you online?
So I have my page on the University of Oregon's History Department website. So you Google Brett Rushforth, University of Oregon, it'll show up. And then I'm on Twitter, and it's just at Brett Rushforth. And I'm on Facebook because I'm old, and that's how I keep in touch with my friends and extended family. I mean, I have Instagram, but that's mostly just for family and personal photos. So I'm not really publicly on Instagram. But yeah, Twitter, I don't know. My Twitter presence is bizarre because I get busy, and then late at night after everyone else has gone to bed, I'll see and comment on a few people's tweets, and then they go off into the ether. Occasionally I post, photos of documents or things like this that, I've been working on. But that's just a reflection of the fact that I don't really have a life other than my research right now. So.
Well, that's probably why you agreed to come on here tonight.
Yeah, just desperate. Someone to talk to.
And that's a wrap at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you to everybody for listening in. Thank you especially to our guest today, Brett Rushforth. Historians of the Movies podcast is produced by Fletcher Powell and created by me, Jason Herbert. You can find Historians at the Movies on Twitter by following me at Herbert History or looking for the hashtag HATM, or you can find us online at historiansatthemovies.com. We'll see you around next time.